What if one of history's greatest tragedies didn't begin with chains, but with trade? Before millions of Africans were forced across the Atlantic, Africa was home of wealthy kingdoms, thriving cities, powerful rulers, and international trade routes. So, how did a continent known for its riches become the center of the largest forced migration in human history? Was the slave trade simply a European invention, or did it grow from older systems already present in Africa? Why did some African leaders participate while others fought desperately against it? And how did religion, politics, and the pursuit of wealth combine to create a business that lasted nearly 4 centuries? The answers are more complex than many people realize. In this documentary, we will separate historical facts from popular myths and uncover the true story of the African slave trade, a story that reshaped Africa, Europe, and the Americans forever. The African slave trade was not a single event but a series of interconnected systems that developed over centuries. Long before Europeans crossed the Atlantic, enslaved Africans were transported across the Sahara Desert and the Red Sea into North Africa and parts of the Middle East. This earlier trade existed alongside different forms of servitude within African societies. Everything changed in the 15th century when European explorers established regular sea routes along Africa's Atlantic coast. The discovery of the Americas and the rapid growth of plantation economies created an enormous demand for labor. Over time, millions of Africans were forcefully transported across the Atlantic, making it the largest forced migration in recorded history. To understand how this happened, we must first understand Africa before European expansion. Only then can we see how economic ambitions, political rivalry, and human greed transformed one of the world's richest continents into the center of a vast slave trading network. Before the Atlantic slave trade, Africa was a continent of thriving civilizations and diverse cultures. Powerful kingdoms such as Mali, Songhai, Benin, Congo, and Great Zimbabwe controlled valuable trade routes and built prosperous economies. Gold, salt, ivory, copper, iron, and textiles flowed through markets that connected Africa to North Africa, the Middle East, and even Asia. Cities like Timbuktu became internationally respected centers of learning, attracting scholars from across the Islamic world. Skilled artisans, farmers, merchants, and rulers contributed to societies with sophisticated political systems and vibrant cultural traditions. Africa was never a single kingdom or one ununified civilization. It was home to hundreds of ethnic groups, languages, and customs, each with its own history. This diversity meant that the effects of the slave trade would differ from one region to another. Yet, together, these societies would face one of the greatest disruptions in African history. Slavery existed in parts of Africa before Europeans arrived, but it differed significantly from the race-based chattel slavery later established in the Americas. In many African societies, people became enslaved through warfare, debt, judicial punishment, or captivity during conflicts. Some enslaved individuals worked within households, on farms, or in royal courts. In certain societies, they could marry, own property, earn their freedom, or become accepted members of the communities where they lived. Their children were not always born into permanent slavery, and these systems were generally not based on race. This does not mean these forms of slavery were human. Enslaved people still lost their freedom and often faced hardship. However, historians distinguish them from the hereditary system that developed across the Atlantic, where Africans and their descendants were legally treated as property for life. Understanding this difference is essential to understanding how the transatlantic slave trade evolved. Religion influenced the history of slavery in complex ways. During the 15th century, the Portuguese crown received papal authorization through several papal bulls that endorsed campaigns against certain non-Christians and permitted the enslavement of captives taken in those conflicts. These documents reflected the political thinking of their time and were later used to justify aspects of Portuguese expansion. Across North Africa and parts of the Middle East, Muslim states had long participated in slave trading under legal tradition and regulated slavery, while also imposing certain obligations towards enslaved people. In practice, however, economic and political interests often overshadow religious ideas. Over time, religion also became a powerful force against slavery. Christian abolitionists formerly enslaved Africans and reformers increasingly argued that all people possessed equal dignity before God. Their campaigns helped build the growing international movement that eventually challenged the slave trade. The story entered a new chapter. During the 15th century, Portuguese explorers, supported by Prince Henry the Navigator, sailed farther along Africa's Atlantic coast than any previous European expedition. Their goal was to find gold, establish direct trade, and discover a sea route to Asia. Earlier exchanges focused on valuable goods such as gold, ivory, spices, and pepper. Portuguese merchants negotiated with African rulers, building trading relationships rather than immediately establishing large colonies. But as sugar plantations expanded on Atlantic islands like Midori and Sao Tome, demand for labor grew rapidly. Enslaved Africans increasingly became part of this expanding commercial network. What began as limited trade gradually evolved into a far larger system driven by plantation agriculture and enormous profits. Few could have predicted that this early voyage would lay the foundation for the transatlantic slave trade, a system that would change the course of world history for centuries. By the early 17th century, the Portugal's dominance of overseas trade was being challenged by the Dutch Republic. In 1602, the Dutch founded the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, to control trade with Asia. Although the VOC focused on Asia commerce, Dutch expansion also supported the growth of Dutch colonial power. In 1621, the Dutch West India Company was established specifically to operate in the Atlantic, where it became heavily involved in the trade of enslaved Africans. The Dutch captured key Portuguese trading posts, including Elmina Castle off the coast of present-day Ghana. From these coastal forts, enslaved Africans purchased from African traders were transported to colonies in Brazil, the Caribbean, and later the Cape Colony. The Dutch soon became one of the several European powers competing for profit from slavery. What had once been regional commerce was rapidly becoming an international business built on human suffering. The discovery and colonization of the Americas created an enormous demand for labor. European settlers established plantations that produced sugar, tobacco, coffee, and later cotton. As indigenous population declined due to disease, warfare, and exploitation, plantation owners increasingly turned to enslave Africans. Beginning in the early 16th century, European ships regularly visited the coast of West and West Central Africa. In most cases, merchants bought captives from African traders and rulers who had acquired them through warfare, raids, or judicial systems. European demand, financing, shipping network and colonial markets expanded this trade to an unprecedented scale. Captives were forced to march to the coastal forts, where they were imprisoned before being loaded onto slave ships. Families were separated, communities were disrupted, and millions began journeying from which they would never return. The Atlantic slave trade had become one of the world's largest commercial enterprises. The transatlantic slave trade formed part of a larger commercial system known as the triangular trade, although route differs. The system generally linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a continuous cycle of trade and profits. Ships left Europe carrying manufactured goods such as firearms, textiles, alcohol, and metal products. These items were exchanged in Africa for enslaved people. The second stage, known as the Middle Passage, transported captives across the Atlantic under horrific conditions to plantations in the Americas. The final stage brought plantation products, including sugar, tobacco, coffee, cotton, and ran back to Europe. These goods generated immense wealth for merchants, investors, shipping companies, and colonial governments. The triangular trade was more than a shipping route. It connected three continents through commerce while concentrating enormous wealth in Europe and leaving lasting social, political, and economic consequences across Africa and the Americas. For millions of Africans, the Middle Passage became the most horrifying experience of their lives. Men, women, and children were chained below the deck of slave ships with little space to move. Voyage often lasted several weeks or even months depending on weather and destination. Conditions abroad these ships were appalling. Poor ventilation, contaminated food, limited drinking water, and widespread diseases caused immense suffering. Many captives died from illness, starvation, or abuse before reaching the Americas. Yet, even under these brutal conditions, resistance never ended. Some enslaved Africans organized revolts aboard ships, while others refused food or attempted to escape. Despite the several consequences, historical estimates suggest that about 12.5 million Africans were forced onto Atlantic slave ships, while roughly 10.7 million surviving the crossing. The Middle Passage remains one of history's greatest humanitarian tragedies and a powerful reminder of the resilience of those who endured it. A common misconception is that Africans accepted slavery without resistance. Historical evidence proved otherwise. Resistance began during capture, continued on forced marches to the coast, persisted aboard slave ships, and remained constant on plantation throughout the Americas. Some African kingdoms fought against slave raiders, while communities built defense or migrated to avoid capture. Many captives attempted escape during their journey to the coast, even when failure meant death or several punishments. Resistance also occurred at sea. Numerous slave ships recorded rebellions in which captives tried to seize control of the vessels. After arriving in the Americas, enslaved Africans resisted by escaping, slowing their work, preserving their language and tradition, sabotaging plantations, and organizing uprisings. Their courage reminds us that the history of slavery is not only a story of oppression, it is also a story of determination, resilience, and the unbreakable human desire for freedom. While much of the Atlantic slave trade focused on West Africa and the Americas, Southern Africa also became part of this system. In 1652, the Dutch established a settlement at the Cape of Good Hope to supply ships traveling between Europe and Asia. As the colony expanded, settlers required laborers to build farms, roads, and homes. Unlike plantation in the Caribbean, the Cape imported enslaved people from several regions, including Mozambique, Madagascar, India, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka. These diverse communities helped shape South Africa's language, food, culture, and traditions. Life for enslaved people was harsh. They worked long hours under strict control, and many were separated from their families forever. Despite this hardship, they resisted by escaping, preserving their cultures and forming close-knit communities. Although slavery was abolished in the Cape Colony in 1834, its social and economic legacy continued to influence South Africa long afterward. By the late 18th century, growing numbers of people began questioning the morality of slavery. Formerly enslaved Africans, religious leaders, writers, and political reformers exposed the brutality of the trade and demanded its abolition. One of the movement's most influential voices was Olaide Equiano, whose autobiography described his capture in Africa and its horrors of the Middle Passage. His story helped many readers understand slavery through the eyes of someone who had lived it. At the same time, abolitionist groups in Britain organized petitions, public meetings, and campaigns against the slave trade. The Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791, further demonstrated that enslaved people would continue fighting for freedom despite overwhelming odds. This effort gradually changed public opinion and increased pressure on governments. Although the struggle took decades, the abolition movement proved that determined activists could challenge one of history's most profitable and deeply rooted institutions. The transatlantic slave trade ended gradually rather than all at once. Britain outlawed its participation in the Atlantic slave trade in 1807, followed by the United States in 1808. Other European nations introduced similar laws over the following decades, although illegal trafficking continued in many regions. To enforce its ban, Britain deployed the Royal Navy's West African Squadron to patrol the Atlantic Ocean. The squadron intercepted slave ships, freed thousands of captives, and persecuted traffickers. Even so, many merchants continued the trade secretly because of its enormous profits. Importantly, ending the slave trade did not immediately end slavery itself. Millions of people remained enslaved across the Americas for decades. Brazil became the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery in 1888. The fight against slavery therefore continued long after governments banned the international trade in enslaved people. The African slave trade left lasting consequences that continue to shape the modern world. Across Africa, millions of people were removed from their communities, weakening populations, disrupting economics, and contributing to political instability in many regions. Some states grew stronger through participation in the trade, while others suffered repeated raids and warfare. In Europe and the Americas, wealth generated by plantation agriculture helped expand banks, ports, shipping companies, and industries. Sugar, cotton, tobacco, and coffee became global commodities produced largely through enslaved labor. Despite unimaginable suffering, Africans preserved many aspects of their cultures. Their language, music, food, religious traditions, and artistic expression became deeply rooted throughout the Caribbean and the Americas, enriching global culture. The slave trade was therefore both a humanitarian catastrophe and a world-changing historical event whose demographic, economic, cultural, and political consequences are still studied by historians today. The history of the African slave trade is more than a story about the past. It is a reminder of what can happen when greed, power, and prejudice outweigh human dignity. For nearly 4 centuries, millions of Africans were captured, sold, and transported across the Atlantic, leaving scars that affected families, nations, and continents. This history is complex. European governments, merchants, investors and plantation owners built and expanded the transatlantic slave trade, while some African rulers and traders also participated by supplying captives through warfare and other means. At the same time, countless Africans resisted enslavement, protected their communities, and fought for freedom at every opportunity. Understanding this history honestly allows us to appreciate both the immense suffering it caused and the extraordinary resistance of those who endured it. Their legacy lives on through their descendants and cultures around the world. History cannot be changed, but it can be remembered, and by remembering it truthfully, we honor those whose voices were nearly lost forever. Leave a comment and subscribe.